On February 26, 2022, a decision was announced that looked like absolute power. 2 days after Russian troops entered Ukraine, the United States and Europe cut Russia off from SWIFT, the financial nervous system connecting banks across the planet. Headlines called it the financial nuclear weapon. Commentators predicted collapse, revolution, and economic ruin. The assumption was simple. If a country loses access to global payments, it cannot survive. But history has a habit of punishing assumptions. Russia did not collapse. Its economy bent, adapted, and rerouted. Trade continued, energy flowed, payments moved, just not through Western channels. And something far more dangerous happened beneath the surface. Dozens of governments around the world quietly reached the same conclusion. If the global financial system can be weaponized against Russia, it can be weaponized against anyone. That moment didn't just target Moscow. It changed incentives for every nation holding dollar reserves, every central bank relying on Western payment rails, and every government that assumed neutrality guaranteed safety. This wasn't a one-off mistake. It followed a pattern that has repeated for more than a century. Every time a dominant power turns finance into a weapon, it accelerates its own decline. The SWIFT cutoff wasn't the peak of American leverage. It was the beginning of its erosion. SWIFT is often misunderstood as a bank or a vault of money. In reality, it is a messaging network, a secure language banks use to communicate payment instructions. When money moves across borders, SWIFT carries the message that authorizes the transaction. Without it, international finance slows to a crawl. Trade contracts fail, settlements stall, and trust evaporates. Created in the 1970s to replace insecure telex systems, SWIFT standardized global payments and quietly became indispensable. Over decades, it grew into the connective tissue of global commerce, processing tens of millions of messages every day. Although based in Belgium, its influence is inseparable from the dollar system. Most international transactions clear through U.S. correspondent banks, giving Washington indirect control. That control is what made SWIFT powerful and dangerous. Access depended not just on compliance with technical standards, but on political alignment. For years, this leverage was rarely questioned because it seemed permanent. The assumption was that no serious economy could operate without it. The Russia sanctions shattered that belief. Once a system designed for neutrality becomes a tool of punishment, every participant must ask whether reliance is worth the risk. When the SWIFT cutoff was announced, it was framed as decisive and irreversible. Western leaders believed financial isolation would succeed where diplomacy failed. The logic seemed sound. Restrict payment channels, freeze reserves, and economic pressure would force political change. But sanctions are not physics. They are incentives, and incentives shape behavior in unexpected ways. Instead of submission, Russia responded with adaptation. Capital controls stabilized the currency. Trade was redirected. Energy exports shifted east and south. Payments moved through alternative systems and local currencies. What was supposed to be terminal became survivable. More importantly, the sanctions sent a global message louder than any official statement. It demonstrated that financial infrastructure was no longer neutral. Sovereign reserves could be frozen. Payment access could be revoked overnight. Legal ownership offered no protection against political disagreement. That realization didn't weaken Russia alone. It weakened trust in the entire system. The effectiveness of financial power depends on confidence, the belief that rules will be honored regardless of politics. Once that belief cracks, nations don't rebel immediately. They prepare quietly. And preparation is far more dangerous to dominance than open defiance. This was not the first time financial dominance was weaponized. In 1914, Britain controlled global finance through London and the pound sterling. When war broke out, Britain froze enemy assets and seized foreign holdings across its empire. The move devastated opponents in the short term, but neutral countries were watching closely. They learned a lesson that would reshape history. Money held under another power's jurisdiction is not truly sovereign. After the war, nations began diversifying reserves away from London. Gold holdings increased. New financial centers emerged. New York rose quietly as trust in London declined. 3 decades later, at Bretton Woods, the pound lost its reserve currency status. Britain's weaponization of finance had not caused immediate collapse. It caused slow displacement. Dominance didn't end in crisis. It dissolved through alternatives. This is the hidden cost of financial coercion. It doesn't destroy enemies first. It erodes leadership. By turning neutrality into vulnerability, Britain accelerated its own replacement. The United States would later inherit that system and repeat the same mistake under different circumstances. The modern era of financial weaponization began in 1979, when the United States froze Iranian assets after the hostage crisis. Billions of dollars were locked overnight by executive decision. The tactic worked tactically. Hostages were released, pressure was effective. But the strategic damage was invisible at first. Governments across the Middle East and beyond realized that dollar reserves stored in U.S. institutions were conditional assets. Political disagreement could turn savings into liabilities. Over the next decade, diversification quietly began. Gold holdings increased, alternative currencies gained share, dollar dominance remained, but trust was weakened. The lesson was subtle but permanent. Financial power could be used without war, but not without consequences. The United States gained leverage over Iran, but lost confidence from the rest of the world. Dominance survives on belief. Once nations understand that compliance, not law, determines access, they seek insurance. And in global finance, insurance means alternatives. The seeds planted in 1979 would take decades to fully mature, but they never stopped growing. When Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, the West imposed limited sanctions. They were strong enough to hurt, but not strong enough to isolate completely. That partial response gave Russia time and motivation. Over the next 8 years, Moscow reduced dollar exposure, increased gold reserves, and built domestic payment infrastructure. Trade agreements were rewritten. Local currency settlements expanded. Financial independence became a strategic priority, not a slogan. Western analysts dismiss these moves as symbolic. Russia was too integrated to decouple. But integration cuts both ways. Dependency is vulnerability only if one side controls the switch. By 2022, Russia had removed many of those switches. When the full SWIFT cutoff arrived, the shock was real, but temporary. The groundwork had already been laid. The lesson was brutal for the West. Sanctions are strongest the first time. Once the target adapts, the weapon loses its edge. And everyone else watching learns faster. The 2022 SWIFT cutoff crossed a line. This wasn't a regional power or a marginal economy. It was a G20 nation with energy leverage, nuclear capability, and global reach. By freezing hundreds of billions in reserves, the West demonstrated absolute control and absolute risk. The immediate effects looked catastrophic. Markets panicked, currencies plunged, confidence vanished. Then stabilization followed, trade rerouted, new payment channels activated, alternative systems scaled rapidly. The most important consequence wasn't Russia's survival. It was global observation. Governments didn't protest publicly. They prepared privately. Central banks adjusted portfolios. Trade agreements shifted settlement terms. Payment systems diversified. From Beijing to Riyadh, the conclusion was the same. Dependence equals exposure. The sanctions succeeded tactically and failed strategically. They proved that financial weapons can be used once. After that, their targets expect them, and expectation neutralizes surprise. Every financial weapon follows the same trajectory. First, a dominant power controls the system. Second, it weaponizes access for political objectives. Third, the target finds alternatives. Fourth, neutral actors hedge against future risk. Finally, the weapon loses effectiveness. We are now deep into stage 4. Countries that were never sanctioned are changing behavior. Reserve composition is shifting. Payment systems are multiplying. Trade is increasingly settled outside traditional channels. This is not rebellion, it is risk management. No country wants to challenge dominance directly, but none want to be defenseless either. The result is fragmentation, not collapse. Financial systems don't disappear overnight. They slowly lose exclusivity. Once alternatives exist, power diffuses. The original system remains important, but no longer irreplaceable. That is the beginning of decline, not dramatic, but irreversible. This shift is measurable. Dollar share of global reserves has fallen steadily. Trade settlement in local currencies is rising. Alternative payment systems are scaling at unprecedented speed. Central banks are buying gold at levels unseen in half a century. None of this requires belief, it requires observation. Infrastructure investment follows incentives. Countries are building redundancy into their financial systems the same way engineers design backups into power grids. The key point is not replacement, but resilience. The world is no longer optimizing for efficiency alone, it is optimizing for survivability. And survivability means optionality, the ability to operate without permission. That change alone weakens any system built on exclusivity. Once alternatives are viable, monopoly becomes liability. The primary beneficiary of this transition is China, not because it forced the change, but because it prepared for it. With trade scale, manufacturing depth, and payment infrastructure, China is positioned to absorb diversification flows. Middle powers also benefit. They gain leverage, autonomy, and bargaining power. No longer trapped between alignment and isolation, they can operate across systems. The losers are not immediate. The United States does not collapse. It adjusts downward. Advantages fade gradually. Borrowing becomes harder. Sanctions lose force. Influence becomes negotiable. Reserve currency status is not a trophy, it is a responsibility. When trust erodes, privilege follows. Financial weaponization is irreversible because knowledge cannot be unlearned. Once countries see reserves frozen and access revoked, they never assume safety again. The systems being built today do not need to dominate, they only need to exist. Redundancy alone undermines monopoly. Even partial diversification weakens leverage. The decline will not be sudden, it will be procedural, quiet, technical. By the time it is undeniable, it will be complete. This is not collapse, it is transition. And transitions favor those who move early, not those who cling to power too long. What happened in 2022 wasn't just a sanction, it was a signal, a message to every government, central bank, and policymaker on Earth. Financial power is conditional, and dependence is dangerous. The SWIFT cutoff did not end Russian trade, it ended illusions. This is how empires decline now. Not through invasion, but through incentives. Not through defeat, but through adaptation. Britain learned this in the 20th century. America is learning it now. If this analysis changed how you see sanctions, money, or global power, then you're beginning to understand the next 20 years of geopolitics. The world is not moving toward chaos, it's moving toward fragmentation. Multipolar systems, redundant rails, competing currencies. The question is not whether this transition will happen, it's whether you'll recognize it early enough to understand what comes next. If you want more deep, pattern-based breakdowns of power, finance, and systems most people never see, subscribe and stay with this series. Because once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it.